The late afternoon light over the Bavarian countryside carried the thin, metallic smell of approaching winter, the sort of air that stung the inside of the nostrils and made every breath feel rationed. A train clattered northward across the fields, its olive-green cars filled with the last engineers of a dying Reich. Among them sat Oberingenieur Karl-Heinz Mahr, his gloved hands folded on a canvas satchel he had carried since the first year of the war. Inside were drawings, tools, and slide rule tables that had once been guarded with a degree of secrecy approaching superstition. Now they were being transported under American authority, sealed not by German military police, but by a sergeant from the United States Army Corps of Engineers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The train swayed sharply. Mahr steadied himself, watching frost form small ridges along the window's edge. It was the morning of early December, in the months immediately following the German surrender, and everywhere he looked, he saw what the Reich had promised him would never happen. American jeeps patrolled the station platforms. Military policemen stood where German railway guards had once paced. The conductor wore a worn civilian coat, not a party insignia. The world Mahr had built his adult life upon one of steel, order, and hierarchy, had collapsed with the abruptness of a snapped girder. He had been told, along with dozens of other engineers, metallurgists, and tool and die specialists, that the train would take them to a processing facility near Frankfurt. It was, according to the American liaison officer, a technical interview site. To men like Mahr, those words carried a different meaning. To them, the approach of American interrogators meant one of two fates: exposure to forced labor in mines and reconstruction camps, or deportation to factories under foreign control. Rumors spread like hairline cracks in stressed steel. Some said the Soviets were already seizing German engineers by the hundreds, packing them into eastbound convoys where entire design bureaus were being transplanted behind the Urals. Some claimed the Americans were choosing skilled men for similarly coercive labor programs, only polished with polite English and better food. Mahr had spent his career designing hydraulic presses for the aircraft works in Augsburg. He had overseen stamping machines capable of forming wing ribs in minutes and high-pressure systems that could bend alloy sheets into curves measured in tenths of a millimeter. He had believed, as millions did, that his work contributed to an impregnable Germany, an industrial power that would outlast nations that relied on distance rather than discipline. Instead, he now sat among surrendered men, listening to the boots of American guards walking up and down the corridors of the train cars. A corporal passed through the compartment, checking lists. His uniform smelled faintly of engine grease and wool. When he reached Mahr, he paused, studied the sheet, then nodded respectfully. The gesture startled Mahr more than if the man had shouted at him. Respect was reserved for victors. Germans of his age had been raised to believe that Americans lacked seriousness, that they were soft, undisciplined, prone to spectacle rather than precision. Yet this corporal, barely older than Mahr's apprentice back in Augsburg, acknowledged him not as a prisoner, but as some sort of colleague. Outside, the train slowed. A station sign flashed past, the letters partly shattered by bullets. As the wheels screeched and hissed against the rails, Mahr braced himself. He expected barking orders, rifle butts against doors, guards forcing them out at a run. Instead, when the train finally halted, a calm voice called down the corridor. "Engineers, prepare to disembark. Bring your personal tools. You will be escorted to transport trucks." It was English spoken with a Midwestern timbre, smooth and unhurried. The engineers shuffled into motion. The canvas satchel pressed into Mahr's side as he stood. When he stepped out onto the platform, the cold air hit him like a thin sheet of ice. He saw no attack dogs, no screaming officers. Instead, he saw a row of American trucks, engines idling, their hoods adorned with white stars that seemed almost painfully bright under the grey sky. A tall officer approached them, wearing the insignia of a major in the Army Air Forces. He carried a clipboard under his arm and wore a sidearm that looked unused. "Gentlemen," he said in clear German, "you will be transported to Oberursel for technical evaluation. Cooperation will be beneficial to all involved. No threats, no rhetoric, no demands for ideological confession, just a flat acknowledgement that they were men with knowledge, not cattle for mining shifts. Still, suspicion clung to them. 2 hours later, they were driven through the gates of a former Luftwaffe signals school, now flying an American flag. The buildings were intact, only lightly scarred by the final weeks of the war. The guards did not hurry them. A field kitchen ladled out stew and black bread. It was the first hot meal Mahr had eaten in 3 days. Inside a converted classroom, he sat at a table opposite 3 American officers. One introduced himself as Captain Willis Harding, a design inspector from Boeing. That single word Boeing hit Mahr with a force he had not expected. During the war, the name had been synonymous with the B-17 and B-24 formations that had scoured German cities with high-altitude precision and later, overwhelming saturation. In his factory, workers had reacted to the name with a mixture of dread and grudging respect. Harding unfolded a sheet of paper. Herr Mahr, we have reviewed your file. You were responsible for the hydraulic forming systems at Messerschmitt Augsburg. You also designed modifications for high-volume spar production. That is correct, Mahr answered cautiously. Harding slid across a blueprint unlike any Mahr had seen before. It depicted an American assembly line, arranged in a U-shaped configuration with overhead transport belts and jigs suspended from reinforced girders. This, Harding said, is part of the Wichita B-29 plant. We're evaluating your familiarity with similar systems. At first, Mahr thought it was a trick question, a test meant to expose inadequacy or false claims. But as he studied the design, he realized it represented something else entirely. The drawing depicted not the aircraft itself, but the organization of labor, the flow of materials, the spacing between workstations. It showed efficiency at a scale he had never imagined. He had been taught, through years of propaganda and professional pride, that German engineering was superior in every dimension, more disciplined, more precise, more theoretically advanced. Yet the diagram before him radiated an industrial confidence that dwarfed anything he had seen in Augsburg or Regensburg, or even the great works at Dessau. Harding watched him closely. You understand the implications, I assume. Mahr hesitated before answering. This plant, it must produce at a rate impossible for our factories. Harding nodded. At peak, Wichita turned out up to 4 finished aircraft per day. That included wing panels formed on hydraulic presses similar to yours, though on a larger scale. 4 aircraft per day. Mahr felt a crack form inside him, as if a long-held structural assumption had finally reached its stress limit. His presses in Augsburg had strained to meet monthly quotas that seemed heroic at the time. He remembered the party officials claiming the Reich was matching American production, even surpassing it. Now he saw the truth on a sheet of drafting paper. The Americans had been building not just machines, but an entire system designed for abundance. And abundance, he realized with a sudden, painful clarity, was a form of warfare more devastating than any bombing raid. Harding leaned back. We're not here to punish you, Herr Mahr. We need skilled men who understand forming stresses, alloy behavior, fracture propagation. You have that knowledge. What we're offering, he paused, searching for the right words. What we're offering is not slavery. It's work, real work, paid, voluntary, and protected under American oversight. The sentence struck the table with the weight of an anvil. Work, not punishment. Payment, not servitude. Protection, not coercion. It ran directly against everything Mahr had been told to expect. For years, German propaganda had painted the Americans as crude industrialists, lacking the philosophical and cultural sophistication that supposedly defined German craftsmanship. He remembered a speech broadcast in the summer of 1943, claiming that American factories were soulless contraptions, manned by untrained laborers punching clock cards like livestock. Yet here sat a Boeing design inspector speaking with technical fluency, offering him a choice, not an ultimatum. Over the next days, Mahr witnessed a transformation he struggled to comprehend. Engineers were grouped into teams, not work gangs. They were given drafting tools, not shovels. They were assigned living quarters with clean blankets and hot water. The Americans issued them notebooks, pencils, even manuals on safety procedures that emphasized worker welfare, something the Reich had only acknowledged in pamphlets and slogans. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. During one inspection session, an American officer placed a thick binder on the table. On the cover were the words, "Standard Practices Metals, Boeing Aircraft Company." "We'd like your professional critique," the officer said. The idea seemed absurd. They wanted him, a defeated German engineer, to review American manufacturing standards? Yet as he opened the binder, a slow, reluctant awe began to grow within him. The manual detailed procedures for preventing stress risers, calibrating tool alignment, inspecting hydraulic seals, and recording cycle counts. Each procedure was paired with illustrations that were not merely instructional, but elegantly clear. It was engineering distilled to its essence: transparency, reproducibility, safety, and scale. He remembered wartime shortages, recycled lubricants, power outages, and hurried improvisations forced by Allied bombing. He remembered producing wing components from alloys with impurities they could not remove because the mines that supplied purer metals had fallen within bomber range. He remembered party officials blaming workers for inefficiency, never admitting that the system itself had collapsed under its own contradictions. One afternoon, he was escorted to a hangar where American engineers were testing high-capacity presses. The machinery was enormous, gleaming steel beams, polished hydraulic cylinders, pressure gauges arranged in neat arrays. The Americans walked around the machines without fear. They wore hard hats, safety glasses, heavy gloves. They used checklists, checklist discipline. It was something German engineers had mocked as an American obsession during the war. They had called it mechanical thinking, a lazy substitute for intuition and professional pride. But as he watched the Americans conduct their tests, each step calmly verified, each reading announced aloud, he recognized a deeper truth. They had found a way to merge discipline with flexibility, mass production with craftsmanship. A sergeant noticed his expression. "Impressive, isn't it?" he said, smiling slightly. Mahr nodded. "Your country does not merely build machines, it builds the means to build machines." "That's the idea," the sergeant replied. As weeks passed, Mahr realized the central irony of his presence here. He had been trained in an ideology that promised superiority through struggle, sacrifice, and obedience. Yet in defeat, he was being treated not as a vanquished foe, but as a potential contributor to a system that valued skill over ideology. One evening, as he walked across the courtyard between barracks, he saw an American mechanic repairing a generator with the help of a German electrician. The two men argued lightly over the correct torque for a mounting bolt, then laughed at their disagreement. Such a scene would have been impossible under the Reich, where fraternization with enemies had been treated as treason. In the dim orange glow of the setting sun, Mahr realized something else. The Americans were not improvising this approach. They had planned for it. They understood the value of knowledge, even enemy knowledge. They saw engineers as assets, not liabilities. The Reich had demanded ideology first and skill second. The Americans reversed the order entirely. Late one night, long after the barracks had quieted, Mahr sat at a wooden desk with a fresh sheet of drafting paper. He had been asked to sketch a concept for a modular wing jig system. As he drew the first lines clean, confident strokes, he felt a sensation he had not experienced since before the war. Purpose without fear. Work without the shadow of political pressure. Creation, not destruction. He paused, resting his pencil. In that moment, he understood the full depth of the irony that had brought him here. He had expected punishment. He had expected degradation. He had expected to be used as a tool of foreign vengeance. Instead, the Americans had offered him a chance to practice the very craft that had once defined his identity, stripped of its ideological chains. They offered him something the Reich had preached but never truly granted: dignity through work, not through obedience. He did not know how long this opportunity would last. He did not know whether he would eventually be sent back to a ruined Germany or transferred to an American laboratory. But he knew, with a clarity that felt both painful and liberating, that everything he had believed about American industry had been wrong. The truth, he realized, was that the Americans had won the war not only through weapons and numbers, but through a system built on abundance, cooperation, and a confidence so vast it allowed them to treat even defeated enemies as potential colleagues. And he, a man who had once designed machines for a regime that believed in dominance through fear, found himself drafting blueprints for a nation that believed in strength through shared knowledge. He sharpened his pencil and continued drawing as the barracks lights flickered once, then settled into the steady glow of American electricity. The first thing that struck Dieter Schmidt when he stepped onto American soil in the summer of 1946 was not the heat, nor the noise, nor even the strange, casual cheerfulness of the soldiers escorting him. It was the smell, an almost unreal scent of oil, warm machinery, and something else he could never quite name, something like possibility. For a man who had spent the last months of the war crawling through the ruins of bombed-out shipyards, surrounded by slag heaps and craters where precision workshops had once stood, the sensation felt almost like sacrilege. They had been processed quickly, efficiently, and with a kind of bureaucratic indifference that unsettled him more than open hostility would have. The Americans had their lists, they had their priorities, they had their own war to win, even after victory was formally announced. And, for reasons he could not grasp, those priorities included him an engineer with a scarred knuckle from a milling machine accident and a memory of drafting tables splintered by falling rafters. The bus that carried him inland rattled along a highway so flawlessly poured it looked as though it had been cast from a single mould. Every few miles, he saw road crews operating equipment he had never seen before. Enormous truck-mounted mixers, graders with hydraulic arms, vehicles so specialized he could not imagine the cost of producing them. Germany had once boasted of engineering mastery, but this felt like cheating. This felt like a country that had solved problems by multiplying resources until the problems retreated in panic. He sat beside a quiet man named Oscar, another engineer from what had once been Bremen's proud maritime construction district. Oscar stared out the window, counting trucks the way starving men counted loaves of bread. After the 20th truck, he stopped counting and simply stared. The Americans spoke to them occasionally. "You'll be comfortable," one of the guards said, though the word guard no longer felt correct. "You're not prisoners. Not really. You're here to work. You're here because you know things." Dieter wanted to ask what, exactly. They believed he knew. He could calculate stress tolerances in riveted joints. He could describe the combustion properties of different aviation fuels. He could sketch from memory the reduction gearing of a standard Kriegsmarine auxiliary engine. But none of that felt worth the trouble of transporting him across an ocean the Americans now dominated with a kind of bored casualness. Their convoy eventually approached a sprawling complex of concrete, glass, and steel that shimmered in the afternoon haze. At first, Dieter assumed it was a city, some new American metropolis built for soldiers returning from the Pacific. But as they drew closer, he realized that every building, every block-like mass of structure, belonged to one facility. A sign declared it Boeing Plant No. 2 in bold letters so enormous they seemed to shout across the landscape. Name whispered among German engineers during the war. Boeing. A word spoken with resentment and a reluctant awe. The way medieval scholars might have spoken of a distant civilization rumored to construct towers from materials no European had ever seen. Boeing planes had come over Hamburg in waves so thick they blotted out the sky, and now he was standing at the gates of the place that built them. Inside, the air carried a low, constant hum, not the chaotic noise of war-torn factories back home, but something steadier, almost musical, the harmonious drone of machines well-maintained and properly fed. He saw conveyor belts stretching what looked like kilometers, each moving pieces of aircraft the size of train cars. Workers, men and women, moved with quiet precision, their motions practiced but not hurried. Everything was arranged in long, flowing sequences, as though an invisible hand guided every part from raw material to final assembly. A man in a crisp shirt and tie greeted them with the brisk cordiality of a foreman who had been told to treat a visiting delegation with courtesy, even if the delegation came from what had recently been an enemy nation. "My name is Richard Lawson," he said. "You men are here to consult, to advise, to help us understand certain engineering methods your country used during the war. And in turn, you'll learn how we do things here. You'll eat with us. You'll sleep in quarters we've arranged. No barbed wire. No dogs. We don't do that here." Dieter exchanged a glance with Oscar. The idea that Americans expected cooperation rather than forced labor felt like a trick. It defied every lesson German propaganda had drilled into them. Prisoners worked, captives served. That was the natural order of things, or so they had believed. Yet here they were, being asked, not ordered, to share knowledge. Lawson led them along a catwalk overlooking the primary assembly floor. Below them, the skeletal frames of aircraft rested in enormous jigs. To Dieter's astonishment, each jig had electric lift mechanisms capable of raising or lowering entire fuselages at the touch of a lever. In Germany, 24 men with pulleys and hand-cranked winches would have spent hours doing what these machines accomplished in seconds. The scale of it left him dizzy. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of workers moved through the lines. Metal skins were riveted in place by teams who worked with the speed and confidence of people who measured progress not in individual planes but in daily tonnage. Lawson watched their reactions. "This is just one plant," he said. "We have dozens. We've been building bombers faster than you can shoot them down, faster than we can find pilots for them, faster than you can imagine." Oscar said nothing, but his hands tightened on the railing. Dieter finally spoke. This cannot be normal. This level of production, these tools, this electricity usage. The materials alone. The materials," Lawson repeated, almost amused. "We have plenty. America makes aluminum like you make potatoes." Dieter blinked. The sentence made no sense. Aluminum was precious. Aluminum was strategic. Aluminum was fought over, hoarded, rationed, and here the Americans treated it like a food staple. Lawson continued walking, expecting them to follow. "You were taught certain things about us," he said lightly. "We know that. You were taught we were decadent, lazy, incapable of sacrifice or discipline. You were taught that we relied on crude mass rather than skill. You were taught that your workers had greater spirit." He gestured toward the bustling lines below. "Maybe some of that was even true, but you were never told the full story." They stopped beside a station where women drilled rows of rivet holes with pneumatic tools. The workers chatted calmly as they worked. There was no overseer shouting at them, no guard with a rifle, no signs threatening punishment for slow performance. And yet the line moved with a speed and consistency that would have been unthinkable in German slave labor facilities. "The difference," Lawson said, "is that our people want to be here. They're paid. They have homes, families, and every one of them knows why they're doing this." Dieter felt a pang of something he could not immediately name. It might have been envy, or shame, or simply the shock of encountering a system that made sense in ways his own had not. In Bremen, he had watched Soviet prisoners drag steel plates across yards under guard, stumbling from hunger, trembling from cold. In Hamburg, he had seen French labourers whipped for slowing their pace after air raids left them coughing from dust and debris. Those men had produced, yes, but they had produced slowly, sullenly, under duress. They sabotaged when they could. They despaired, always. Here, the workers, women with scarves tied around their hair, men with rolled sleeves, young apprentices barely out of school, moved with a quiet pride. "This is impossible," he whispered. Lawson raised an eyebrow. "Impossible is a dangerous word. You Germans used it often, but reality doesn't care what you think is possible." They were escorted to a drafting room where blueprints covered entire walls. Large tables were scattered with pencils, rulers, and mechanical calculators so advanced they seemed like science fiction compared to the clunky devices Dieter had used in Europe. American engineers greeted them with polite nods but continued their discussions, tracing airflow models and structural stresses with the ease of men accustomed to abundant resources and stable working conditions. One of the Americans, a tall, lean engineer named Harold Keating, approached with a faint smile. "You're the team from Bremen?" Dieter nodded. "We were. Yes." Keating extended his hand. The gesture startled him. In Germany, engineers from enemy nations might be greeted with suspicion, if they were greeted at all. "We've been studying some of your pre-war work," Keating said. "Your diesel engines, especially the large-format marine ones, were quite elegant. Over-engineered, maybe typical German habit, but elegant." Dieter felt a spark of pride, quickly followed by bewilderment. "You admire our work?" "We admire good engineering," Keating replied. "Politics is temporary. Physics is not." They spent the next hours answering questions about fuel consumption rates, metallurgy practices, turbine efficiencies, cold weather reliability. The Americans listened carefully, taking notes, occasionally asking for clarification but never treating them as inferiors or as tools to be used and discarded. At one point, Keating placed a blueprint on the table so large it nearly brushed the floor. It showed a bomber design unlike any Dieter had ever seen, sleek, powerful, impossible by the limitations Germany had faced. "This is a concept," Keating said. "A post-war possibility. We're not sure yet what the next decade will require, but we're thinking ahead. That's the secret, you know. Not reacting. Anticipating." The sentence stung. Germany had not anticipated. Germany had lunged from crisis to crisis, stretched resources to breaking, relied on slave labor to compensate for shortages it refused to acknowledge. And in the end, nothing had held. Later, dining alongside American engineers in a cafeteria that served meat, vegetables, and fresh bread. Fresh bread. Every day, Dieter found his hands trembling again. Not from fear this time, but from a gnawing realization that everything he had believed about the enemy's weakness had been a lie built on wishful thinking. Back home, rations had been carefully measured. Thin soup, ersatz coffee, dark breads bulked with fillers. Here, food seemed almost embarrassingly plentiful. Workers carried trays piled high with warm meals, leaving nothing behind but conversation and laughter. "This is why you won," Oscar said under his breath. "This, not tanks, not planes, this." Dieter nodded slowly. The next week, they were allowed invited, even to participate in design reviews. American engineers asked them what Germany had done to streamline certain processes, how they had compensated for aluminum shortages, what lessons could be drawn from the failures of late-war production. It was surreal. He was helping the people who had destroyed his city. And yet, strangely, he felt more respected here than he had in the final years of the Reich, when engineers were berated for delays caused by shortages they had no power to fix. One evening, Keating walked with him through a hangar so large it could have swallowed an entire block of Bremen's shipyards. "You know," Keating said, "we expected something different from you men." Dieter raised an eyebrow. "Different? We figured you'd be angry, bitter, maybe even defiant. But you're quiet, almost sad." Dieter considered this. "We were raised to believe we lived in a nation of unmatched discipline and industry. We were taught that we would triumph because our people worked harder, sacrificed more, and understood order in ways others did not." "And now?" Keating asked. Dieter looked out across the hangar. Rows of completed fuselages gleamed beneath overhead lights, each one a testament to a system that had harnessed not fear but optimism, not brutality but a kind of collective faith in competence and purpose. "Now," he said softly, "I realize we were not superior. We were desperate." Keating nodded, as though he had expected the answer. In early autumn, Dieter was shown a room filled with machinery he had only heard rumors about, giant presses capable of stamping entire wing sections from single sheets of metal. Their force measured in tons so high he could scarcely comprehend the engineering required to control them. American workers operated them with calm assurance, following procedures that had been refined through experience rather than fear. A senior foreman explained that most of these presses had run continuously throughout the war. "We never needed to move them," the man said. "We never needed to hide them. No bombs fell here." No bombs. The words echoed in Dieter's mind. He remembered nights in Bremen when the air raid sirens had wailed and the sky had turned red as thousands of tons of explosives fell in neat, methodical patterns. He remembered trying to continue calculations by candlelight in the basement of a wrecked office, trembling as distant concussions rattled the floor. Standing beneath the towering stamping press, he understood something deeply painful. Germany had fought with courage, perhaps, but America had fought with abundance, and abundance, backed by deliberate industrial planning, had proved the decisive weapon. Near the end of that year, during a design meeting, Lawson unexpectedly turned to Dieter and asked, "What would you change, if you could, in your old system?" The question startled him. No American had asked him something so personal, so pointed. He answered honestly, "I would give men reasons to work that were not based in fear." Lawson nodded slowly, as though confirming a theory. Fear can motivate, but only for a while. Pride lasts longer. It was the closest thing to a lesson anyone had offered him since arriving. As winter settled in, Dieter found himself studying American blueprints with a sense of reluctant admiration. He saw how designs prioritized maintainability, how production lines were planned years ahead, how supply chains were built for redundancy. He realized that the Americans had not been improvising victory, they had been constructing it brick by brick, worker by worker, long before Germany understood the scale of the conflict it had unleashed. One night, walking alone along the perimeter of the plant, he paused beneath the vast shadow of a nearly completed bomber. Moonlight glinted along its polished skin, turning it into something almost otherworldly. He rested his hand on the metal and felt its cold certainty. This plane would fly thousands of kilometers. It would do so reliably. It would be serviced by mechanics trained in schools built specifically for that purpose. It would be fueled by refineries that operated without interruption. It would be crewed by men who ate well, slept safely, and believed their nation could deliver victory because they had seen evidence of it every day. He felt very small. For the first time since the war ended, he understood the full depth of the psychological deception he had lived under. Germany had not lacked bravery. It had lacked imagination. It had not lacked talent. It had lacked the will to build systems that respected human dignity, that invested in people as assets rather than expendable parts. The Americans had not won because they were blessed with resources. They had won because they had learned how to turn those resources into strength without crushing the people who wielded them. In that moment, Dieter felt something like acceptance. He whispered to the empty hangar, "We never stood a chance. Not against this." And for the first time, the thought did not fill him with shame, only clarity. The first thing that struck Friedrich Kappel when he stepped through the chain-link gate of the holding center in late autumn of 1945 was the smell. Not the sharp, acrid reek of burning magnesium he had come to associate with German factories under bombardment, nor the cold, metallic tang of wet concrete that clung to the walls of the underground tunnels where he had once helped oversee forced labor. This was something else entirely: warm oil, fresh sawdust, cigarette smoke, and the faint sweetness of machine lubricant. It was the smell of a factory that was not dying, but thriving. A place designed for production rather than endurance. A guard tapped him lightly on the shoulder, urging him forward. "Keep moving, sir," the young man said, not with hostility, but with a strange awkwardness, as if embarrassed to be giving orders to a former engineer nearly twice his age. Friedrich obeyed. The path led toward a makeshift warehouse on the far edge of the Kansas plains. The facility did not look like anything the Reich had built. There was no barbed wire curling from high fences, no armed patrols marching in rigid cadence. Instead, there were chalk markings on the concrete, clusters of workers carrying clipboards, and large painted arrows directing men toward various intake stations. It felt improvised, temporary, yet impossibly well supplied. This, Friedrich realized with a tightening throat, was the difference between a nation preparing for war and a nation that had been living inside one for a decade. He recognized several faces among the German prisoners, clustered nearby. Men he had known from Peenemünde, men from BMW's Aero Engine Division, a handful from Junkers. But most were strangers, captured technicians, draftsmen, mathematicians drawn into the pipeline of what the Americans called Operation Paperclip, though none of them yet understood what that meant. He had expected interrogation, humiliation, possibly trial. What he had not expected was to be asked for his resume. The American officer at the intake desk, a bespectacled major with ink stains on his fingers, looked up as Friedrich approached. Name? Friedrich Kappel, he answered stiffly. Specialization? Structural stress analysis for heavy lift airframes. Previously assigned to the Dornier and Junkers research branches. The major nodded as if Friedrich had told him something mundane, like his preferred brand of coffee. He flipped through several clipped sheets, then gestured toward a second building. You'll be evaluated for industrial placement. Follow the blue line, please. The blue line was painted directly onto the concrete. It curved gently across the yard, passing between towering pallets of lumber and stacked crates marked with stenciled serial numbers that meant nothing to him. Everything here was in motion, forklifts growling, pneumatic hammers knocking, factory whistles crying out in the distance. Every worker seemed to know exactly where he was supposed to be. Efficiency without fear. Order without barked commands. It unsettled him. He followed the line into a wide-roofed hangar. Inside, rows of desks stretched into the distance. At each one sat an American engineer in shirt sleeves, speaking calmly to a German prisoner while flipping through diagrams or setting down slide rules. This was not an interrogation hall, it was a hiring fair. His handler stopped at the 7th desk in the line. A woman looked up something else he had not expected. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with dark hair pinned back neatly, her sleeves rolled up to reveal ink-dusty forearms. She wore the insignia of a senior drafting officer. Her expression was neither hostile nor sympathetic, it was professional. Mr. Kappel? She asked. Yes, please sit. He took the chair opposite her, feeling the faint creak of its wooden legs. She slid a folder toward him. My name is Margaret Ellery, she said. I'm with the Boeing Advanced Design section. We're reviewing technical backgrounds for potential integration into several reconstruction projects. I'll be evaluating your experience. The word struck him sharply. Integration. He had expected confinement, not integration. You've worked on stressed skin fuselage structures? She asked, already scanning his captured personnel outline. Yes. Mainly for medium bomber frames, though in the final year I was assigned to load analysis for a heavy transport prototype. Good, she murmured, making notes. We're especially interested in your work with torsion box assemblies. Your designs appear to have performed well under prolonged vibration stress, even in adverse temperature swings. She said it plainly, without admiration or accusation. She was simply evaluating the facts. He sat quietly, hands clasped, unsure how to respond. You understand that your placement is voluntary, she continued. If you choose to decline, you'll be transferred to a long-term detainment facility until repatriation procedures are established. Repatriation to what? He asked, before he could stop himself. Her pen stopped briefly. She looked up with that same level gaze that American officers seemed to excel at. That, she said gently, is not for me to determine. He nodded. The truth hung between them like a heavy curtain. She flipped a page. One more question. What was your direct involvement with forced labor operations at your previous assignment? There it was. The question he had feared since the moment he surrendered. I supervised efficiency workflows, he said carefully, not personnel punishment. Did you report production deficiencies caused by labor illness or fatigue? Yes. Did you recommend corrective measures? Yes. And were those corrective measures implemented? He hesitated. Yes. She looked down again, not writing, simply letting the silence stretch. Then she closed the folder. Mr. Capel, she said finally, the United States government is not offering you absolution. What we are offering is an alternative to prolonged confinement. Your technical knowledge may be useful to us. That is all. He felt something cold settle under his ribs. He thought of the tunnels carved into the earth near Nordhausen, where he had once walked past lines of skeletal workers whose eyes never rose above their feet. He had tried to convince himself that he was not responsible for what happened to them, that he had been merely an engineer, nothing more. But he knew that was a lie. Your record indicates you were not in an administrative role concerning discipline, she said. That is a significant factor in your placement eligibility. He exhaled, slowly. You'll be assigned to Wichita, she said. It's a design facility. You'll have housing, clothing, rations, access to medical care. You will be under supervision, but not imprisonment. The words struck him with a force he could not understand. Housing, safety, work, all the things that millions of displaced Europeans could no longer even imagine. I see, he said quietly. She offered him a pen. Sign here. His hand trembled as he wrote his name. When he stood to leave, she extended her hand as if this were an ordinary professional appointment. He hesitated, then accepted it. Her grip was firm, dry, confident, not deferential, not hostile, just human. He left the building with a slip of paper indicating his transport assignment and a bundle of contradictory emotions pressing inside his chest. The wind across the Kansas plains carried dust and the hum of distant machinery. He followed the painted blue line back toward the yard, where other Germans were being sorted, some to menial labor camps, some to interrogation wings, and a few, like him, to American industries that required their expertise. The sun hung low over the horizon, a broad smear of gold fading into violet. He remembered the last sunset he had seen in Germany, standing on a cracked airfield outside Dessau as the final prototypes were burned to prevent capture. The sky then had been filled with smoke and the distant thud of artillery, the silhouettes of ruined hangars stretching like broken teeth. Here, the only thing in the sky was a contrail, clean, white, slicing across the blue with the effortless certainty of a nation that had built more aircraft in a single month than Germany had managed in an entire year. He boarded the waiting truck. The engine rattled to life. The convoy pulled away, heading toward the small rail spur that would carry them deeper into the American heartland. As they drove, he watched the fields pass by, vast, uninterrupted, impossibly fertile. Not the bomb-scarred countryside he had trudged through during the final retreats. Not the starving villages where children scraped frost from empty windows. Here, barns stood unburned. Silos towered full, roads were paved, land was abundant. And as the miles drifted past, he began to understand a truth he had never been allowed to contemplate. Germany had not merely lost the war. It had never been capable of winning it, not against this, not against a nation that could build aircraft factories faster than the Reich could bomb them, not against a nation that could conscript its engineers into design labs rather than into the front lines. Not against a nation that had mobilized not through terror, but through an unyielding confidence in its capacity to produce. For the first time, Friedrich felt the full weight of the propaganda he had once believed. The stories whispered about American decadence, the leaflets claiming their factories were inefficient, their workers lazy, their systems chaotic. It had all been lies. Lies built to keep German engineers compliant, convinced that their sacrifices were necessary and their suffering noble. Yet here he was transported, not to a punishment camp, but to a design facility, a place where he would be asked to build, not destroy, to innovate, not brutalize. He thought again of the tunnels, of the men who had worked until they collapsed, of the reports he had signed, of the justifications he had whispered to himself in the darkness, and he wondered why he, of all people, had been chosen for mercy. The train was waiting when the convoy arrived. A broad-shouldered conductor gestured them aboard. The carriage was clean, the seats cushioned. It felt surreal. As the locomotive lurched forward, carrying them southwest toward Wichita, the landscape widened into endless plains. Hours passed. Conversation rose and fell among the passengers, exhausted engineers speaking in low voices about what awaited them. Some were suspicious, some hopeful, some, like Friedrich, simply numb. Night settled outside the windows, turning the prairie into a vast black ocean. Somewhere in that darkness, America's industrial centers pulsed with electric light. Assembly lines roared. Machine shops thrummed. Research labs glowed with fluorescent brilliance. Even in peace, the engines of industry did not rest. The war had ended, but its momentum had carried forward, transformed into something larger, an assertion of global reconstruction, technological dominance, and unapologetic ambition. Friedrich stared into the night. He had spent his entire adult life believing that Germany held the pinnacle of engineering excellence, that the Reich's innovations in aerodynamics and propulsion represented the future of aviation, that the world would one day turn to German craft as the standard for modern flight. But now, aboard this quiet American train, he felt that belief collapsing under the weight of what he had seen. The Americans possessed not only capability, but scale. Not only scale, but vision. And for reasons he could not yet comprehend, they intended to use him. He leaned his head against the window, listening to the rhythmic clatter of the wheels as they carried him deeper into a land that, until the surrender, had existed in his mind only as an enemy caricature. Tomorrow, he would walk into a Boeing design facility. He would see machines and techniques he had never imagined. He would stand beside engineers who did not threaten him, who did not shout, who did not speak the language of fear. Tomorrow, he would begin to realize the full measure of the world he had been kept from understanding. The train rolled on through the night, and Friedrich Kappel, once a man certain of the Reich's invincibility, now faced a future he had never believed possible, one where the victors did not merely demand retribution, but demanded his knowledge, not out of pity, but because they could use it, and because they could afford to. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.